Ravens flock. Some major news broke a few days ago regarding the AFC North. The Pittsburgh Steelers traded wide receiver George Pickens to the Dallas Cowboys. Caught a lot of people off guard. Became probably the biggest news this offseason post NFL draft. But some interesting news that came out shortly after that flew under the radar when it comes to the rest of the NFL, but caught the attention of many Ravens fans was the fact that prior to the Cowboys reaching out to Pittsburgh, they actually reached out to the Ravens to see if they can acquire Rashod Bateman. Now, I don't remember. Actually, I do remember. The last time we had a receiver that another team actually was interested in was like Hollywood Brown. And that was like, I mean, that was only like 4 years ago, but it feels like forever at this point because so much has happened since then. But yeah, we're typically not the team that other teams are falling over themselves, hoping that they could trade for one of our receivers. But I think that speaks volumes about the Rashod Bateman potential and what people see in him in the first place. So you got to wonder, why do the Cowboys want Rashod Bateman in the first place? Like, what was the goal there? Well, if you remember, last year, over the past 2 years, we've been seeing a lot of statistics come out regarding Rashod Bateman's dominance when it comes to creating separation. like in 2023, we all know, we saw the charts. Rashod Bateman, far and away, was the best receiver in football at creating separation. And then even this past season in 2024, he wasn't leading the league, but I believe he finished top 3. So you're talking about 2 back-to-back years of being top 3 in the league in separation. Like, we as Ravens fans have talked about that many times, and we obviously aren't the only people paying attention to that. Like, these other teams have people that get paid to keep an eye out for people in Rashod's position, like those guys who kind of never lived up to their potential, who they could get on a cheap contract. And to me, that goes into what I think is also the other reason why the Cowboys reached out to the Ravens first before George Pickens. I mean, before the Pittsburgh Steelers, is because right now Rashod Bateman's on a cheap contract, and he's going to be on that contract until the end of the 2026 season. So we have him for this season and next season. Now, for the people that don't remember, I'm sure most of you do, but for the ones that forgot, Rashod Bateman kind of got screwed by, I don't want to say it was 100% his lawyer's fault. It's kind of his fault too, but it's just a major misunderstanding. But during Rashod's rookie contract, he had obviously he dealt with injuries. There was one event in the offseason, I can't remember what it was, but there was an event, there was an event that he had to show up for that he didn't show up for because he was nursing an injury. But his lawyer did not inform him that him not showing up for that event, him not showing up that day, put him in a position to where he no longer was eligible for a 5th-year option, which put him in a bad spot, of course, because he also had a bad season from a production standpoint that year. He again, in 2023, he led the league in separation yards. He had the most separation of any receiver, but as far as actual production, that's when we had, obviously, Zay's rookie year. Odell was on the team. Like, there was a lot happening. So Bateman, I think he only finished the year with like 300 yards. So he was in a pretty bad spot where his lawyer not giving him the right information, not letting him know, put him in a bad spot where he couldn't really do anything other than maybe walk, and he wasn't going to get picked up by any team, especially not for any decent money. And the Ravens took advantage of that. It's a tough situation. Like, you kind of feel bad for the player, of course, right? But at the same time, the Ravens did what they should have done, which is take advantage of the situation. And then they paid him a very, very cheap contract. Well, a relatively cheap contract. He's making about roughly $6.5 million a year, more or less, which, regardless of how you feel about Bateman, that's severely underpaid. That is a very low price for a guy like Bateman, who, as of right now, he's a wide receiver too, but we've all talked many times amongst ourselves in the Ravens fan base about how we think he could potentially be a wide receiver 1 if he gets more targets, and then also if he stays healthy. And then even if you think he's never going to be better than a wide receiver too, $6 million a year is still insane. Like, wide receiver twos at this point in the NFL are making upwards of like 18 to $28 million a year. So $6 million, super cheap deal. I'm sure the Cowboys were looking at all this and saying, hey, we would like to scoop him up and be able to get that contract for the next 2 years, because you also got to keep in mind the Cowboys are in a weird spot where they have a bunch of people they need to pay as well. They just extended Dak. I think they gave CeeDee Lamb an extension. I can't remember. If they didn't, then they have to give CeeDee Lamb an extension. And then they also have to pay Micah Parsons. And Micah Parsons, you're talking about a top 5 edge rusher in the league. They're going to give him at least $30 million a year. So a guy like Rashod, who could be a really solid number 2 next to CeeDee Lamb, I'm sure they thought of that as a very attractive opportunity, but the Ravens shut it down. And then you got to think, well, why would the Ravens want to turn down that offer? Well, the number one reason, of course, is the cheap contract. For what Rashod has been able to do so far and the trajectory that he is currently on, to have him on a deal where he's only making $6 million, that is a very, very, very massive discount that they have him on. And from the Ravens' perspective, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to give that up, especially for relatively low draft compensation, or low value as far as draft compensation, because Rashod doesn't have the production that George Pickens has. And even in the case of George Pickens, the Cowboys only offered a 3rd-round pick as well as a couple of 2027 picks that are like, I think, 5th and 6th round. So if they only offered that for George, I would imagine for someone like Rashod, who hasn't had the production that George Pickens has had so far, and also has had more injuries and is a year older, they probably didn't offer any better than that. They might have messed around and offered the Ravens maybe a 5th-round pick at best. That's what I'm assuming happened. And then another reason I think the Ravens didn't trade Rashod is because the Ravens still have high hope for him. Like many of us Ravens fans, we see the film of Rashod, just even when he's not getting the ball thrown to him, some of the routes he's running, how we're seeing when he does start to get opportunities, he starts to make things happen. And I would imagine, just like how we have a lot of hope for him still, the Ravens front office has a lot of hope for him as well. And they're hoping that him and Zay could be a very, very solid wide receiver duo. Then I also started thinking about, hey, like with Rashod Bateman, Rashod doesn't have a choice either way what happens to him here, but if he had a choice, I kind of wondered, like, would Rashod Bateman go, or would he want to go, right? Because you look at the Cowboys, they're a more pass-happy team, and that's not necessarily a great thing because there's no balance, because the last time the Cowboys had a really good running attack was back when Ezekiel Elliott was in his prime still. Ever since that era ended, they've had no running attack whatsoever, so Dak has been throwing it a lot. So from a stat standpoint, I would imagine that would be a little tempting for Rashod, because of the fact that you would imagine even with you being the number 2 to CD, you still can mess around and get a lot of targets and put up some good numbers, and then also get a lot of one-on-ones, because when you got a guy like CeeDee Lamb on the other side of the ball who's a top 10 wide receiver, that would allow you to get a lot of one-on-ones. And Rashod Bateman, when he's getting one-on-one opportunities, he's been showing us for the past 2 years that he could be an absolute monster, especially when it comes to those intermediate routes. But at the same time, I would imagine Rashod, well, I can't read his mind, but I would imagine it would still make more sense for him to want to stay here, because we're a team that, despite the flaws, despite the criticisms that I have for guys like Eric DeCosta and John Harbaugh, I still think in general we are a team that's closer to a Super Bowl than the Dallas Cowboys. Not to say they're a bad team, they're still a good team, but we're in a position where we have playmakers at positions that they don't. We have a better quarterback. No, even though Dak is good, Lamar is the best quarterback in football right now. we have other pieces on the team like Isaiah Likely and Mark Andrews and Zay Flowers and all that. We have Derrick Henry. We have a running attack, so there's balance. The Dallas Cowboys, as of right now, they still have no running attack to speak of. Now there's still pieces on the Cowboys that we don't have as well, of course. Like they have Micah Parsons, who's a top 5, maybe even a top 3, maybe even a top 2 edge rusher in the league, depending on who you ask. And we don't have that. We're hoping Mike Green can be that, but as of right now, we don't have that. And they also have solid corner play over the past several years with guys like Trayvon Diggs and Deron Bland. Then they also have a true number 1 wide receiver in CeeDee Lamb. But again, in general, I still think we have more pieces and we're closer to a Super Bowl than they are. We're still only a year removed from being in the AFC Championship game. You know, we're still only a year removed from being one fumble away from beating the Chiefs in the AFC Championship game. And we're also, one fumble and a drop 2-point conversion away from beating the Bills in the divisional round and going back to the AFC Championship game. So, again, my point is I think we're closer than the Cowboys. So I would imagine if Rashod was smart and thinking long term, which, believe it or not, I think he is, because if he wasn't thinking long term, I think he would have just left last year once he found out that he wasn't getting the 5th-year option, once he wasn't eligible. But I think ultimately he will be happy that he did not get traded. And I think something like this can also boost his confidence a bit. And I don't think he has a confidence problem right now. I think any questions about his confidence, that was more of like a 2023 thing when he was coming off of the injury. But at this point, I think he clearly should be more confident than ever. He's uploading a bunch of vlogs to his YouTube channel, so he's definitely more confident. And clearly Lamar and Todd Monken are making him more and more of a priority, so there wouldn't be much reason for him to want to go at this point, especially when he's thinking about what he can become next year if he just stays on the trajectory that he's currently on. But let me know what your thoughts are. Do you think that it was a good idea for the Ravens to choose to not trade Rashod Bateman? And are you excited for what you believe Rashod Bateman can be next year, now that he has another year in this offense, now that he's finally been healthy for multiple seasons in a row, and now that he's starting to work his way back into being one of the main priorities in the passing attack?